I sometimes feel very sorry for people in local government because all the time they're dealing with cuts, restrictions, and the government in many ways controls a lot of what local government does today. But in the past, it was a little bit more different, and not quite often local government was the spot which seemed to organise a lot of the reforms that we later accepted even in Parliament. And when I first started in Camden, one of the names on the front page so often of the local newspaper was Millie Miller, who was inspiring in many ways in some of her things and also fighting to preserve other things. And who better to talk about it than Bernard Miller? So over to you, Bernard.
Thank you. Before I go on, can everybody hear me okay?
Yeah.
Good. Okay, in that case, first of all, I'd like to thank you very much for inviting me. It's a strange situation. What you're looking at the moment is my family tree. And when I say my family tree, it was actually Millie's tree that she planted in Tavistock Square. It's the 100th anniversary of her birth. So she would have been 100 this year, but she only made it to just over half that. And about 2 years ago, 3 years ago, I had joined the Jewish Genealogy Society and was busy finding relatives all over the world. And some people said, why don't you do something about your mum? So I agreed to do an initial presentation, and it has turned into several, because as I've gone to different archives, starting with the Camden archives, which have been invaluable and whom I have to thank, people would say to me, oh, would you do a talk for us? And I realized her life was so varied and covered so much ground that it's actually easy to give different talks to different groups. So I'm not going to keep talking. I have a request, though. If I tell you things about which you have added information, inside knowledge, possibly documents or photographs that you'd like to share, please feel free to contact me. And if you've got questions as I go through, please ask them when I get to the end. So, welcome, and I hope you will be able to follow this. I hope the technology will let us work. And is it doing it? Yes, here it comes. This is really my opening screen, and you may not realize it, but what you are seeing there is 7 or 8 pieces of Millie's legacy. And I'm not going to explain them now. I will come back and explain them at the end, but I hope that as I talk, some of them will become explanatory. As I explained, this would have been her 100th birthday, and 1922 was 100 years ago. And it was the year in which Millie was born, and her life was anything but roaring in the 1920s or in any other decade. But it's important to understand how she got to where she ended up. But we're now looking at a map of Clerkenwell in 1902 in the Charles Booth Poverty Map section. And the arrow is pointing to the house where she was born. And if you look at the index on the side, the key shows that she was in one of the streets which was mixed moderate poverty and comfort mixed. And I'll tell you a bit about where she was born. She was not born in Camden. She was born nearly a mile away. Camden was on the left and separated by a strip of Islington. The names have changed since then. Holborn was Holborn, Clerkenwell in Islington was Finsbury, and Hoxton, where she was born, was Shoreditch. But you'll hear more about the borough name changes as I go along. And if we look at the 1921 census information that was published this January, we can find out stuff about the house. The street, as you can see, was Windsor Terrace, but it was not the workhouse where she was born. This is her birth certificate. She was born the 8th of April, 1922, Millie Haring, born to Barney Haring and Sarah Zomerplach. And I'll talk about them in a minute. But we're going to go back to 1921 and look at the census return. And she always said to me that she was born in a triangle. And I never really understood what the triangle meant. But if you look at her father, the head of household, you'll see he was born in London Spitalfields, although his parents were born in Amsterdam. My grandmother was born in Amsterdam in Holland, and their two older children, Shelley, or Rachel as she was originally named, and her brother Harry were both born in Antwerp in Belgium. And this is the triangle in which they were born. And you can see the different people. My grandfather on the left, born in London, my grandmother born in Amsterdam, my uncle and aunt born in Antwerp. And she used to say it was a matter of luck where you were born because they moved around this triangle all the time. But why did they move around this triangle? Well, we're going to find that out in a moment. She described the house in which she was born as 6 rooms, 6 families, a shared sink on the first floor landing, and a shared toilet in the backyard. The 1921 census shows 5 families. In 1919, at the end of World War I, her father was invalided out of the army with malaria and mononucleosis and leukocystitis. He was shown as being a diamond brilliant polisher. That's the person who does the finishing of the diamonds. And that starts to explain the triangle, because the triangle, London, Amsterdam, Antwerp, was also known as the Diamond Triangle. They were the 3 centers of the diamond trade. And my grandfather had one of the lowliest jobs in the diamond trade, a diamond polisher. Unfortunately, because he ended the war with a tremor from which he never recovered, he was never able to work again as a diamond polisher, because you don't want people with tremors handling your diamonds. 1 century earlier, this gentleman had rented a room in the same house, only he looked more like this at the time. And while he lived there alone and worked long hours in a shoeblacking factory, his parents and siblings lived here in what looks like a very luxurious setting. It was the Marshalsea, or the Marshalsea Debtors Prison, and the Marshalsea Debtors Court. And later on in life, this man was to write about the house in what is described as his most autobiographical work. His name, Charles John Huffam Dickens, better known as Charles Dickens. And when he wrote about Windsor Terrace, it was the home of a gentleman called Mr. Micawber. Mr. Micawber is supposed to be based on his father. And you can actually see the house in this picture. The one with the number 9 above it is the house where my mother was born, and Windsor Terrace is written on the wall. The streets are still there, Windsor Terrace and the cross street, Edward Street. But if you overlay a modern map on it, you get something slightly different. Windsor Terrace is still there, but Edward Street has now become Micawber Street, presumably Hackney honouring the Dickens work which talked so much about Windsor Terrace. So what does somebody who's out of work in 1921 do? My grandfathers on both sides were out of work in 1921. There's no indication on the census of what they did, but I remembered my mother telling me that both of them had worked in these kinds of locations, which were all around where they lived. A series of markets. The last one being Hoxton Market, which was only 2 streets away from them. And I remember my father telling me that he had been able to juggle plates when he was a 7 or 8-year-old, because he had to sell dishes on a market stall. So I'm guessing that that's one of the things that they did. However, the star on the left marks where the house was. Just 1 block away, on the other side of the workhouse, was a site where this building had stood. This is known as the Eagle Tavern. It had started off as a tavern in the 18th century. It had become a music hall seating up to 2,500 in the 1820s. And by the early 1850s, it was a new music hall seating 4,000. It was also the main location for the star of the period, one Mari Lloyd. The Eagle, you will hear in a minute, spawned a dance craze that traveled around the world. Only I didn't know until I started researching this, that this was a dance craze. And when I was looking at this picture, I suddenly saw, ringed in purple, this building that says Baths. And I remembered my mother saying twice a week they went to the public baths. And I'm guessing that since that was 1 block away, that was the one that they went to. If you looked up City Road, you would see the Angel Islington. The building at the top is my bank branch and has been for several decades. If you looked down and went across the roundabout at Old Street, you would eventually come to Cheapside, where St. Mary Le Bow Church is. That meant that my mother, like her father, like myself and my sister, were all born in the sound of Bow bells, and we're therefore all true Cockneys. And I'm going to call on a relative here. I like to use relatives if I can, to tell us a little bit about just this bit of road.
Up and down the city road, in and out of the Eagle. That's the way the money goes, up goes the weasel.
And until I actually started researching this, I had assumed that Pop Goes the Weasel was and always had been a children's song. But it turns out that it was a dance popularized in the Eagle Tavern, and that it spread across the world. So within a year, it had become a dance craze in the United States, where many people claim it as their own. I just want to explain how this relative is related, because this is one of the fun things that you get from genealogy. He was married to a 7th cousin of my mother's. They shared these great-grandparents that you see at the top. Jonas Yomtov Gerson Cohen-Klot, born in Amsterdam in 1653, and Miriam Sachmans, born in Hamburg in 1659. The family was Sephardic Jews originally from Spain and Portugal, who had sought refuge in Belgium, the Netherlands, and Germany in particular. And if you look at the descent lines from them, on the left, my mother's line, on the right, her cousin's line, you'll see that they mostly stayed in Holland until, on the right, Joseph Assenheim moves to London, a generation before my grandfather, and then his children move on to South Africa. But it's the last connection that I think is interesting, because I was surprised to see who this seventh cousin of my mother's was. And here she is. One Joan Collins, strange name that, married to one Anthony Newley. He was the one who sung us the song. And it's only thanks to the existence of computers and genealogy online that it's possible to find this stuff out. So I just share that with you for fun. Back to where she was born, 9 Windsor Terrace in Hoxton, the Haring family in 1921. The picture on the left is not from 1921, it's from 1899, and it's by a photographer called H.W. Fincham, who was the official photographer for this organization. The Order of St. John, which is 1/4 mile away, and they were the founders of the St. John Ambulance. And he, like many people in socially conscious organizations, was recording particularly the poverty that they saw around them. They have a museum, which I haven't visited yet, but as a result of discovering it from this, I intend to. But back to Millie's family. In 1921, her father, mother, brother, and sister were all living there. In 1922, Millie arrived, and in 23, her younger sister. I'll only talk about them from now on, and then only briefly about Yetta. And just up the road, there was a school. And this is the only picture I have of my mother and her sister at primary school. And I wonder if that was the school they were at. I have one earlier picture where I'm guessing she was at Southend-on-Sea because they had lots of relatives. So on the left is a picture I took when I was there with my aunt about 6 years ago. And on the right, joining up with it, is Millie Haring, as she then was, Millie Miller, as she was to go on and become, aged about 2. Now, I know from an interview that she did with the Old Camden Journal that she started school at 2.5. And I wonder, because I never asked, whether it was the school that was on the next block, just over Edward Street, now Micawber Street. And this is a slightly later picture, and you can see her there, and you can see her little sister. And according to her, and backed up by my aunt, she had just beaten up a much older boy who was teasing one of the girls. And she had made it absolutely clear that she would not tolerate that kind of behavior. And according to my aunt, that boy never, ever misbehaved in her presence again. In 1928, there was a revolution. My grandmother got the vote, and that revolutionized both her life and the lives of society, and of course of Millie, although she probably hadn't realized it at the time. She would have been 6 years old. But among the effects that it had were that, having gone from demanding votes, all of a sudden women were casting votes. And these are 3 pictures from the 1931 general election. And it produced this, a group of women MPs on the terrace of the House of Commons in 1931. But in 1929, they moved from Windsor Terrace and the old Micawber House to Stoke Newington, 16 Brighton Road, and she would live there until 1945. In 1933, I think, she received a scholarship from the LCC to go to a grammar school. Her father didn't want her to go. He believed, as a good working class boy, that grammar schools gave you airs and graces and made you stuck up and made you think you were above her station. And that was an idea that stayed with her all her life. But she did, for 4 years, go to Dame Alice Owen School, only half a dozen blocks from where she was born. A school founded by Dame Alice Owen some 400 years earlier, after she'd survived being shot with 2 arrows that you can see there. She was the widow of a rich brewer, and she used some of her money to set up this school, of which Millie became a recipient or a beneficiary. And I put this picture in because I know that the physical exercises that they did at school were very important, and they picked up on a problem that she had had. And the only other picture I have of her is aged about 9, and you can see what the problem was. She was bow-legged, and they gave her extra physiotherapy and physical exercises. And by the time I knew her, which was quite a while later, she was definitely no longer bow-legged. And this was a local synagogue where she went to a youth club. It's now been turned into a mosque, but I think it may have been where she joined the Jewish Lads and Girls Brigades and met my father, not there, but in a summer camp that they went to jointly. At 14, she left school, and her first job was with an organization helping organize Jewish refugee rescue from Germany and Eastern Europe. And she left it after 3 weeks because while she was surrounded by people like this, she had to go past people like this to get to the office. And one of the things that she couldn't stand was she discovered that this organization, supposedly helping refugees, was only helping the refugees with money. And she didn't want to be part of that. So she changed jobs, and she got a job at the Elephant and Castle. You can see she complained about the traffic there, and it looks pretty bad, although this is more like what she would have seen in the 1920s, and she worked for Burton's, where she handled cash in these strange machines that took the cash from a cash desk in the front of the store to a central cash office where it was handled, the change was given, it was sent back by pneumatic tube to the customer. And if you look right in the front, you can see the Elephant and Castle. And the elephant is looking out over the Burton store. And I put this picture in because it's one of these synchronicity things. We were driving past the Elephant and Castle one day, and I was working for the Department of the Environment in a building called Hannibal House. And I said, "Oh, that's where I work." And she said, "Really?" She said, "That's where I worked." And this was the Elephant and Castle around 1973. The Elephant and Castle are on the right and will appear. And my office is where the X marks the spot. So both of us had our first full-time jobs on the same site, although in very different circumstances. But she didn't stay there very long. She was doing shorthand and typing. She got a series of short-term jobs before ending up at Clerkenwell Green. Clerkenwell Green, less than a mile from where she was originally born, only 100 yards from the boundary with Camden. And she would work close to or in Camden for most of the rest of her life, at least part-time. And she got a job in this building. This magnificent building is the old Middlesex session houses, built in the 18th century. It was a courthouse, and it had been beautiful in its time. That was the back of it, which backs onto Farringdon Road. And this is what it looked like when she worked there. She was there from 1938 to 1945. And I'm not quite sure what she did. I know what she said she did, but she would never give any details. And it was because she had signed the Official Secrets Act. But if you look on the right at the top, you see what most people associate with Avery scales. If you look on the left, you'll see they did things that tested the breaking strength of wire, they produced weigh bridges, and she said they produced, or they weighed everything from chemicals to aircraft. In 1939, the world changed, and her then boyfriend, my father, was called on to volunteer rather than being conscripted, and he signed up on the 3rd of June, 1939. And I know that because she only kept a diary for about 4 months in her life, but it covered that. And it said he had signed up for conscription on the 3rd of June. Just going back to the job at Avery's, she said in an interview to the old Camden Journal that she had gone in as a shorthand typist, I think a 16-year-old, and because it was a protected job in a protected industry, she came out at the end of the war as the head of the department responsible for negotiating with government and fulfilling government contracts. So she must have learned something along the way. And I think she learned some skills that stood her in good stead. If we look at the 1939 population register, it shows her as Millie Miller, but she didn't get married until the following March. And it also shows MBSN, Metropolitan Borough of Stoke Newington, first aid, clerical work, and Clissold. Clissold was the Clissold Road Baths, and it was where she spent all the time in the war that she wasn't in Clerkenwell. And we'll leave that for the moment. Oh, no, we won't. This is the marriage register. I'm sorry. My father, who had been serving in France, got a weekend off in March 1940, came home, got married, and then was posted to North Africa. The honeymoon consisted of cycling to Southend, where my mum had an aunt and uncle who had a guest house, and they were supposed to have a bedroom, but they ended up being stuck in the scullery under the sink because Uncle Charlie had overbooked and didn't want to lose the money. So that was their glamorous honeymoon. And talking of glamour, the dress that my mother is wearing there was not hers, it was my aunt's. My aunt was about 4 sizes bigger than her, and it was kind of pinned together for the occasion. But this is where she spent the rest of the war, having been recruited in some way to the Air Raid Warning Patrol Service. I think it must have been the super attractive uniform that really got her hooked. And she always wanted to know why they worked in this building. She said it was the only building in Stoke Newington that she knew that had a roof that was entirely made of glass. And they were supposed to be doing bomb warnings and protecting other people from bombs. And she never understood the logic of that. That's not the front of the building, it's the bit back here that had glass all around and over the top, over the pool part, which is where they were working. And she said that this is where she got her political education, with this man, Samuel Fichtenberg, and with the other people that she worked with. she said when they weren't doing the air raid warning and bomb checking, they talked, and they talked politics. And this man, and some of you may recognize him, this is 6 years later. Here he is with his wife and 2 daughters. He persuaded her to join the Labour Party. And at the end of the war, 1945 came, she joined the Labour Party. He persuaded her, like him, to stand for Stoke Newington Council. And these were the results. The Daily Express, of course, said that it would be Gestapo in Britain if the socialists win. So they haven't changed much. And here is Stoke Newington Town Hall. And in 1945, Millie was the youngest councillor in the country, and she was representing the Labour Party, and she loved the Labour Party badge. She loved the symbolism of the pen for education, the torch for enlightenment and learning, the spade for work, the specific mention of liberty. She thought all of those things were really important. I don't think you can get that out of today's red rose. And I'm not going to go on at length because I could be talking forever. And I'm just going to run through some of the things that happened between then and when she started in Camden. So we've already had the air raid warden and the marriage. In 1943 to 5, her sister, brother-in-law, cousins and grandparents died in Auschwitz. In the 1945 elections, she was elected the youngest councillor in the country, and she got pregnant. But in 1946, she was diagnosed with Hodgkin's disease and given 3 months to live. Radiotherapy failed dramatically. Chemotherapy failed dramatically, but she was put on a form of radiotherapy that was experimental. And eventually my sister and I were born, but her life expectancy was reduced to 6 weeks. It didn't stop her. She got a college diploma in social work, became chair of housing, the youngest ever mayor of Stoke Newington, co-founded the predecessor to CND, had Labour Party roles nationally and internationally, was a magistrate, justice of the peace. And then our house in Stoke Newington was compulsorily purchased and we moved to Highgate. She visited Denmark. She was on the Consumer Council, the Committee on Consumer Credit, the Commission on Leasehold Reform. She chaired Labour Women. She chaired the Labour Campaign for Mental Health, the Labour Campaign for Human Rights, for abortion rights. She was an active member of the Socialist Medical Association. She set up a Stoke Newington Association for the Housebound. She started working with Caribbean and Asian community groups and was particularly concerned about their employment situation. And of interest to Camden, throughout the 50s and 60s, she worked 1 or 2 days a week in Hatton Garden, but not as a diamond polisher and not as a jeweler. She worked for a cousin who was a small jeweler, and she did his books and accounts. And a little bit more, 1959, she moved to Highgate, St. Pancras then. 1960, she was on the St. Pancras Council. 1964 was the creation of Camden Council. In 65, Camden Council took over. 67, she was Camden's first woman mayor. 71, the first woman to lead a borough. And then she stepped down to contest Ilford North in a general election. She was only there for 3 years and died at the age of 55. And she never lived to see completion of a lot of her heritage in Camden. And you're going to see some of the bits that she did see and that did survive. And then you'll see some of the stuff that didn't. This was the first meeting, the first statutory meeting of the new council of the London Borough of Camden. And she's there right in the middle. And you may guess that one person stands out because she's wearing white and all of the other women except one are wearing dark and fairly sedate looking colors. More importantly, the man in the mayor's chair is one Samuel Fichtenberg, as we'd met him earlier, who had now become Sammy Fisher. And he was the interim leader of Camden Council, Camden's first mayor. He was the first person to receive a knighthood in Camden when it was Camden for his services to local government. And he went on to become Lord Fisher of Camden. But now back to the creation of Camden and a little bit of the background history so we can understand it better. There was a big challenge for the government in the 1950s, and local government needed reorganizing. It had last been seriously reorganized in the 1850s, so the government set up the Herbert Commission, which was tasked to see what changes in local government would better secure effective and convenient local government. And 3 years later, it came up with recommendations of a new Greater London regional government region and 54 boroughs. Unfortunately, rather like the people who do reports for the government today on things like nutrition, they weren't the reports that the government wanted. It didn't want a report that told it what changes would better secure effective and convenient local government. This was the problem it was trying to tackle. From 1899 to 1961, the control of London had been Liberal, then Conservative, and from 1934 onwards, continuously Labour. And they wanted a reorganisation that would get Labour out of London government. And so in 1962, they came up with this proposal, that they would replace the London County Council with something called the Greater London Council, covering an area previously served by 100 boroughs, and they would be replaced by 33 local authorities, each one with a new coat of arms. Those were the old ones, these are some of the new ones. And since the Herbert Commission had failed to provide the change in balance and control the government had wanted, it tried to ensure that the new boroughs and the strategic authority would have a conservative bias. In what was to become Canvas, they did it by merging 2 conservative boroughs with 1 Labour one. But it didn't bring the results they wanted. In the 1964 election, Labour won the whole of Camden with a majority of 8 seats. And it set about building a new Labour administration. The borough needed a name, and they were critical of what was happening in some other boroughs like Hackney, where the biggest and most powerful of the boroughs gave its name and the others had to fit in. Or Islington, the same thing, where Finsbury became absorbed into Islington. And because they had a strong Labour majority, they had a lot of discussion. And a full transitional authority was established in 1964, which ran in parallel to the old boroughs until 1965, and it was headed by Sammy Fisher. And in 1964, we had 3 boroughs, Holborn, St. Pancras, and Hampstead, each with its own coat of arms. And the heraldic experts came up with a coat of arms for Camden. And here it is. Now, I could do a talk just on heraldic coats of arms and the history that they tell, but I don't want to do it because they decided that this was not the image that they wanted to project as a progressive, trendy local authority in the swinging 60s. So they had a discussion, a form of rebranding. And after arguments between the very wealthy Holborn and Hampstead, it was Charlie Ratchford's suggestion, seconded by Millie, that they choose the name Camden, which was considered to be something of a slum because it was associated with a very rundown Camden town. And what they were doing was a form of rebranding and reclaiming. And this is the symbol or the logo of Tate and Lyle's. It's from the biblical story of Samson. Out of the strong came forth sweetness. And they were working towards this idea of strength coming by combining their sweet efforts. And so it was a job of creation for which I have to thank Michelangelo for the hands from the creation. But the first task was come up with a name. And they liked the idea of naming it after rivers. The Fleet and the Tyburn were both in Camden. The only problem was that both of them were sewers. They ran underground, and the Tyburn had particularly unfortunate associations with the gallows at Marble Arch. So they tried out some names combining bits of them, and they didn't work. And they tried combining bits of names of the old boroughs and some of them with bits of the rivers, and they didn't work. And so they settled on the Charlie Ratchford, Millie Miller proposal for Camden. And they said, we are going to reclaim Camden. We are going to make the name Camden synonymous with progressive ideas, ideals, and getting things done. So back to the creation. They now needed something to replace the coat of arms. And if you look at these hands from the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, you can see that they appear to be reaching out to each other. And they thought this was a very appropriate symbol. And they should have 4 hands, each one representing one of the old boroughs working with the new borough. And I made a suggestion at that point that they do a stylized version of the hands, which I drew like this. And if I'd known how strong the letter C and the idea of Camden were to become, I would have done this. But anyway, they went off and they took the idea to a young architect branding designer called Michael Wolff, because if you work with a single hand, and most people don't, particularly when you're collaborating, most people have 2 hands and they use them both. If you just use a single hand, you get something like this, which looks a bit like an ice cream logo. And Michael Wolff came up with this very clever idea of putting the hands in pairs. And he came up with the lettering, which was a mixture of old and new. And over the years, that was the Camden logo until around 1991, when it suddenly went green. And I can find, I've been through the archives, I can't find any record of why that decision was taken. I can find leaflets saying about how the logo is to be used, but not why it went green. And now it's gone black. And this is interesting as part of heritage. In April this year, there was a contest among the London boroughs and their logos. And in a vote of 4,000, 54% voted Camden's logo as the winner, with Hackney, which is there, coming second. So 50 years on, well, almost 50 years from her death, one bit of her heritage lives on. And I'd never quite understood how the hands worked until I changed them into different colors. I always tried to make that a pair of hands. So each quadrant, top right, top left, bottom right, a pair, but I realized that it only works if you have them top, bottom, left, right. And now we move on to some of her physical legacy. This is Prince of Wales Road and St Pancras Baths in Kentish Town, looking west from Kentish Town Road in 1900. This is 1960s, there are the baths. And this is how it would have looked in 1901. It has now been extensively refurbished. This is it from a Google map last year. And I'm going to take you round the corner. I know you had a talk some time ago about the history of the refurbishment of the baths. I think it probably won't have shown you the bits that Millie was proudest of. So let's move round the corner. Past the Grafton pub. And to what is now the main entrance. And I'm going to go past the main entrance, and you will see on the right, the ladies' baths, on the left, the public wash house. And you will, if you were paying attention, remember that as a child, my mother had bathed twice a week in the local baths. In the 1960s, when she was on Camden Council, she was chair of the Baths Committee. I think they called her chairman at the time, but she put an end to that when Camden was formed. And she was responsible for the overseeing of the refurbishment. And she knew that people living around the baths at that time would have had baths, this is what I showed you before, would have had baths in slipper baths like this before the refurbishment. And she changed the bathrooms to this. Now, it may not look very modern now, but this was the 1960s, and that was the last word. And the wash house wasn't just for washing yourself, it was for laundry. And this was a laundry rack pre-1950s refurbishment. And all of these pictures are from the Camden archives. I found them online, and I am happy to be able to use them. To replace the drying racks and the old scrubbing sinks, there were super modern stainless steel automatic washing machines, high-speed spin dryers, rotary ironing machines, and something that was a real first, public self-service dry cleaning machines. But it wasn't just that she was proud of. If we come out and look across the road, we will see some housing. And this article does not relate to this housing. I could not find any documents on the particular house, but in one of those three houses, the council had bought a house and converted it into 3 flats. But this was about how the council was providing money for house owners and landlords to modernize their homes. And if we go along the block, we will see at the end of this block on the left, a house, the one that has been extensively cleaned 50 years earlier, the same house, in an article from the Camden Journal. And I've tried to blend them together. It was being used by the council to showcase modernization and full electricization of the houses and to explain the grants that were available. And if we go back and just go along this block, we will get just some of the things that the council was doing in housing. It was buying, rehabilitating and letting, providing home improvement grants, cooperative loans, housing association loans, council multi-unit conversions, DIY co-build, renovating finance, and it was buying to protect. And this is a very important part of her legacy. In Camden, we had some of the worst rogue landlords in the country. They made the Ruckman landlords of the 1950s look good. And we had tenants associations in what we now consider to be fabulous blocks of mansion flats coming to the council, begging them to buy in order to protect them. And here's just some of those protected blocks. Arkwright Mansions, Gordon Mansions, Lissenden Mansions, Langbourne Mansions, Makepeace Mansions, more Makepeace Mansions, Museum Chambers, and Great Russell Mansions. Museum Chambers is where Frank Dobson lived for years. And why is this buy to protect? It was protecting more than just the tenants and the housing, as you will see. And if you look at the last two, Museum Chambers and Great Russell Mansions, they were protecting Bloomsbury as well. This square would almost certainly have been destroyed had plans for the British Library gone ahead. At the time the plans were announced, Camden was busy digging a hole to put in a car park, which you can't see now. This is Bloomsbury Square as it is today, and as it has been saved. If the British Library had been built, all of this would have gone, and there would have been a 7-story blank wall, providing the security that it was felt was needed on an urban enclosed site. It was a dreadful scheme. I am not a great fan of what was finally built at St. Pancras, but at least it didn't destroy Holborn in the process. And one of the first things with which she was associated when she became leader of the council was the purchase of a boat, and it got a lot of criticism. This is the boat. And it was not just an isolated purchase, it was part of a program to rehabilitate and reclaim the canals and turn them from dumping grounds into public assets. And it worked. And this is a leaflet that I found in the archives about the Tarpoli, the boat that she bought. It was built and converted by the council for the use of community groups, and it took them all over the waterways. And this image shows Millie at the front of the Tarpoli with a group of school children. The Tarpoli is now no longer in Camden. It is about 150 yards from Camden. This is the boundary, Camden on the left, Islington on the right, and it's moored by the London Canal Museum. In 1981, with swinging government cuts to local authorities, it was felt that they should get rid of the Tarpoli, but there was a big enough campaign to save it that in 1982-3, it was converted to make it accessible for the disabled or people with disabilities, and it was rescued and given a new lease of life. Eventually, in more cuts, it was decided that the council could not afford to keep it, but they handed it to a trust, the Camden Narrowboat Association, which continued to run it as a public service. And it does, as you can see on the right, all-day trips, Christmas lunches, evening trips, residential trips. They arranged special groups for Chinese seniors, disabled, Asians. It's been a fantastic community resource. The problem that it now faces is that there are basically only a small team of volunteers running it. And without a local authority backing, it is certainly questionable whether it can continue. Now, I haven't got time to go through all of the things that Millie did when she was rescuing. So I've listed some of the stuff that she saved, and I think I should really do a completely different talk on the things that she saved. Bloomsbury, the Roundhouse, the Camden Lock Studios and Workshops, St Pancras Station, Tottenham Court Road, Hampstead Road, Regent's Canal, large parts of Camden saved from the Ringway, Crossway and Motorway Box, Covent Garden, several theatres, including some outside Camden, and multiple blocks of flats and streets of good restorable housing. Those are just some of the things, and I would love to talk about them and her involvement in each of the schemes, but there isn't time. So I'm going to move on to one of her main bits of heritage. This is not Camden. This is 1970, Vestervang, Aarhus in Denmark. And she visited this complex when it was under construction, and she brought back a picture of it. And she gave it to Sidney Cook, who was the borough architect. And I can only, if you're interested, only recommend very strongly that you get the book Cook's Camden, The Making of Modern Housing by Mark Swennerton. The building or the complex on the cover, which is very reminiscent of Vestervang in Denmark, is actually the Alexandra Road estate. And I'm just going to run through some of the housing estates which were initiated by her, but which she never lived to see completed. And that's because she was leader from 1971 to 74. Most of these didn't start until late 72, 73. They took 3, 4, 5 years to be completed, and she had died by the time they were completed. This is Alexandra Road. This is Highgate Newtown Phase 1. This is Branch Hill, probably the most fabulous housing in Camden Council's portfolio. This is street housing in Gospel Oak, infill of 2-story housing, where they managed to double the density and still give people gardens and terraces and provide off-street parking. And again, it's based on similar principles. I won't name all of the architects, although I'm happy to take questions on them. And the last one is Maiden Lane. And like almost all of these, they were completed, Maiden Lane was completed when Frank Dobson was leader of the council. Now, he had not actually been on the council when they were initiated. He had started off on the first elected Camden Council. He had stood down for a while because his employer, I think it might have been the London Electricity Board, it was certainly a public undertaking, did not want its staff working in local government. But he came back, and when Millie died, he was elected with a good majority as leader, and he fought for these schemes. So I'm very happy for him to be associated with them, but they are not his schemes. These are all programs that she started. And I'm going to take you back to the start because I've simply overrun time. I could go on at great length about all of these things. And I said I would explain what you're looking at about her heritage here. And so, first of all, the cherry tree. Having been one of the founder members of CND in the 1950s and a member of Hampstead CND in the 1960s, when she was mayor, she planted this tree on Hiroshima Day, the 6th of August, in commemoration of the people who died in Hiroshima, and with the wish that there should never again be war, and certainly not nuclear war. So you've got that, which is part of her heritage. And just a personal note here, the very last talk that she gave in her life, last public talk, was in this building behind. And this is Tavistock House. It was the home of the Board of Deputies of British Jews. And she gave a talk to a Jewish women's organization about the rights of the Palestinians. And she said to me that it was one of the best talks she had ever given, and it was very well received. And it was basically condemning the Israeli government and its actions in the 1970s, before it had moved a long way to the right. So I very rarely say I'm proud of stuff that she did that I wasn't part of, but I'm proud that she took that stand. And the condolence letter from the organization that she spoke to refers to her talk and say how much they enjoyed it and how forthright she was. But you've got the tree, you've got this building, you've got her interest in international affairs, you've got her religious life, which I'm not even going to start, but at the time of her death, she was vice president of her synagogue, having been chair for many years. And you have, if you look at this thing that I'm moving the arrow round, or this one, you have got the Camden name and the Camden logo. So in that one picture, you've encapsulated 7 different bits of heritage. I would love to go on for much longer. I know that I can't, and I know that I've already overrun time, for which I do apologize. I'm very happy to take questions, comments, and if you have anything that you'd like to share with me, I would be happy to receive it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bernard. It's amazing to think at the time when she was so active that Camden was doing so much in the field of housing. Housing is one of the worst problems in London today, and seeing all it was attempting then was quite amazing, and so much regretted that so much of that action has been lost in today. But are there any questions, please?
I stunned everybody into silence.
Can I see anyone want to ask anything?
Can I just say something on housing?
Yes.
Because when she became a member of parliament, she had been offered a peerage by Harold Wilson, who wanted her to lead on housing in the Lords, but she didn't believe in unelected politicians in a second chamber. And so she declined the offer and fought and won a general election. But she was able to pilot through Parliament one of the most progressive bits of housing legislation ever, the Housing Single Persons Act of 1977, the year that she died. Unfortunately, before it had had a chance to be implemented, Labour had lost a general election. Margaret Thatcher took over and she swept that from the board and replaced it with her own housing legislation in 1988. Can I just say one other thing? The first thing that Millie did on her first day in office as leader of the council was to sign an order stopping the sale of council houses, which the Tories had started. She would not be able to do that now because the Tories have introduced and maintain a right to buy. But at that time, there was no such right in legislation. So housing was the center of her life. I mean, she lived and breathed housing. The only other thing that she lived and breathed was rights. She used to carry around a little booklet, and I didn't know what it was until she died, and I had to go through her handbag. And she carried a little booklet of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And when issues arose in meetings, she would look at this little booklet and check whether or not they were in compliance with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And I kept it with me for quite a while. Unfortunately, it got destroyed. I was in a helicopter crash in Angola, and I had it in my back pocket, and the pocket and the book were ripped off. So I no longer have that.
Right.
I do have a quick question, if I may.
Please.
As much
Please.
to you, Malcolm, as to you, thank you, Bernard. and that's whether or not the talk you've given, which is just, you know, full of so much, is in any way recorded or available. I'm thinking, for example, of people I know who live on, well, what is now called the Whittington estate, although, as you pointed out, it's Highgate. Someone who wrote the Golden Age of Housing, and I know that he would be fascinated to, particularly on all that area. And I'm just sort of wondering how those who weren't able to join you tonight can get access to your talk.
Well, this is one of the features of the Camden History Society's website. On the right, Lindsay there is one of the people who organises, where it's possible to do so, the recordings of the talks that any of the members can access by going onto the Camden History website. So now there's quite a few talks recorded there that you can catch up on if you've missed them.
Probably 2 days, 2 or 3 days maximum, and it should be on our website. Well,
thank you. I look forward to hearing it, because I never know what I've said. I mean, I use the slides to prompt me, but I've got nothing written down, so it's really valuable to me as well.
Right. Are there any other questions?
Can I just add on talks that this is the second talk that I have done, and this is very specific to kind of legacy aspects of Camden. I probably will have another 4 or 5 over the remainder of what would have been her 100th year, so up to next April, and they will all cover different ground. So I'm happy to let you know if you want to sort of publicize it for members.
Well, if you can, if you can
talk.
send the details to me, Bernard, you can perhaps go into our Camden History Society newsletter. The July one is already designed and will be ready to go out to members very soon, but certainly the September one onwards would be available.
And I would be happy to come back and do something on some aspect or some other part that I haven't mentioned, if anybody wants me to, and if that's not being greedy.
Right. Well, thank you very much, Bernard. I think that's a wonderful insight into one of the leading Camden characters, a person who I remembered in when she was leader and even as mayor, front page of many of the papers, sometimes supporting her, sometimes criticising her, but always there with a view and with ideas and also defending things. So thank you very much indeed, Bernard.
Thank you for inviting me, and it was a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.